She weighed 130 pounds, soaking wet, and she stepped in front of a violent drunk to protect a child she had never met, while every grown man in that town looked the other way. They laughed at her. They called her foolish. One man in the crowd actually said, "Lady, you're going to get yourself killed over somebody else's kid." She didn't move an inch. This is the story of Clara Bennett, a woman who arrived in a broken town carrying a heavy trunk, a shattered past, and a kind of courage most people never find in a lifetime. Stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and become part of our family, because we tell stories like this every single week and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The stagecoach rattled into Harlan's Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the town smelled like horse sweat, coal smoke, and something else Clara Bennett couldn't quite name, something sour underneath everything, like old anger that had never been let out. She pressed her face close to the window as the coach lurched to a stop. What she saw was a main street barely wide enough for two wagons to pass each other without argument. Wooden storefronts leaned at angles that suggested they'd been built in a hurry and never fixed. A dog was sleeping in the middle of the road, and nobody seemed interested in moving it. Clara sat back. This is it, she thought. This is the place. She had told herself the whole journey, all 11 days of it, that she wasn't going to have opinions about the town before she arrived. She was going to be practical. She was going to be useful. She was going to be the kind of woman the advertisement had asked for. Capable, hardworking, willing to take on frontier life without complaint. She had packed her trunk the night before she left Boston. Packed it carefully, folded every dress, wrapped the glass bottles in cloth so they wouldn't break, placed the journals on top so they'd be easy to reach. Then she'd stared at that trunk for almost an hour, sitting on the edge of her narrow rented bed in the boarding house where she'd lived for 2 years, and thought about how strange it was that everything she owned in the world fit inside a single wooden box. She was 31 years old. Most women she'd grown up with were married with children by now, settled into the kind of quiet domestic life that Claire had somehow always failed to find. Not for lack of trying, not for lack of wanting it. There had been a man once, back in Philadelphia, who had seemed like the kind of man worth building something with. But that was before the incident at the hospital. Before everything unraveled, before she packed a different trunk and moved to Boston with nothing but her father's tools and a reputation that would never fully recover. So when she had seen the advertisement, widower, 7 children, mountain ranch in Colorado, seeking capable woman for marriage and partnership, she had not felt romantic about it. She had felt practical. She had felt like maybe this was the kind of place where a woman's history didn't travel faster than she did. She answered the letter. Elias Walker had written back in handwriting that was blunt and unpolished, the letters pressed so hard into the paper they'd left indentations on the back side. "I don't need a companion," he'd written. "I need someone who won't collapse under pressure. I've got 7 children and a mountain that doesn't care whether we survive the winter. If that sounds like something you can handle, write back." She had written back. The stagecoach driver, a heavy-set man with a mustache that had seen better years, hauled Clara's trunk down from the top of the coach and dropped it on the wooden sidewalk with a thud that shook the boards. "Town's smaller than it looks on the map," he said, which Clara took to mean it was even smaller than she already thought it was. "Thank you," she said. She stood there for a moment, trunk at her feet, the wind coming down off the mountains like something with a grudge, and looked around for a man who might be Elias Walker. She had no picture of him. He had sent none, and she hadn't asked for one. She figured she'd know a mountain rancher with 7 children when she saw one. What she saw instead was a child. A boy, maybe 7 years old, small and wiry with dark hair that needed cutting, standing very still outside the general store about 30 feet away. He was holding a small paper bag, the kind the store used for penny candy, pressed against his chest like it was something worth protecting. And standing over him was a man who was not his father. Clara knew that immediately, the way you sometimes just know things. The man was big in the way that happens when strength has curdled into something else. All of it going to the gut and shoulders, face ruddy and loose, boots planted wide like he was having trouble keeping himself upright. He was drunk. It wasn't noon yet, and he was drunk, and he was reaching for the boy's paper bag with one hand while the other hand pointed a finger at the child's face. Give it here, the man was saying. Give it here, or I'll tell your daddy what I saw you doing behind the... He didn't do anything. The words came out of Clara's mouth before she'd fully decided to say them. She was already moving, her boots clicking on the wooden walkway, her coat still dusty from the journey. She stepped between the man and the boy and stopped, and she did it without running, without any drama at all, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The drunk man blinked at her. The boy made a small sound behind her. Not quite a word. Lady, the man said. He had eyes that were trying to focus and not quite managing it. Lady, this is none of your... It looks like it is, Clara said. Her voice was calm. That was the thing people would remember later, that her voice was calm. Not because she wasn't frightened. She was. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but she had learned a long time ago that fear and stillness weren't mutually exclusive. You could be terrified and still stand in one place. The man took a step toward her. He was a foot taller than she was and outweighed her by 100 pounds easily. She did not move. You don't know what you're doing, he said. Move along, she said. You're done here. There was a silence. Clara was aware of people watching. She could feel it, the particular stillness of a crowd that's decided to observe rather than intervene. A woman in a doorway. 2 men leaning on a post outside the barber shop. A handful of others who had found things to look at across the street that suddenly seemed very interesting. Nobody moved. The drunk man's face changed. The irritation shifted into something uglier, something that wanted to make a point. You're not from here, he said. Are you? No, Claire said. I'm not. Then you don't know how things work. He took another step, close enough now that she could smell him. Whiskey and tobacco and something rank underneath. Women around here know better than to get themselves involved in things that... Harlan. The voice came from behind Clara. A different voice. Low and flat, with the particular quality of a man who had learned that he didn't need to raise it to be heard. She turned her head. The man standing in the street was lean in the way that hard physical work makes people lean. Not thin, but stripped down, no wasted material anywhere. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by something beyond just climate. Dark eyes, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 3 or 4 days. He was holding a cloth sack in one hand, supplies from the general store, from the look of it, and he was looking at the drunk man named Harlan with an expression that was completely flat. Walk away, he said. Harlan looked at him. Something passed between them. History, Clara thought, some old calculus of who owed what to whom in a small town. And then Harlan made a sound deep in his throat that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite an insult, and he walked away. He didn't hurry. He made sure not to hurry, but he went. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The boy behind her made a small, soft sound. She turned to look at him and found him staring up at her with wide, dark eyes, the paper bag still clutched to his chest. You all right? She asked. He nodded, barely. Good. She crouched down so she was closer to eye level. What's your name? Silas, the boy said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Silas. She nodded. That's a good name. Is he going to bother you again? Silas looked past her at the man who had come to help. My pa's here now, he said quietly. He won't. Claire straightened up and turned to find the lean man standing closer than she'd expected, looking at her with an expression that was harder to read than Harlan's anger had been. There was something assessing in it, not unfriendly, but not warm either. The eyes of a man who had learned to measure things before he committed to them. Ma'am, he said, you shouldn't have done that. Somebody had to, she said. You could have been hurt. Possibly. She picked up her traveling bag, which had fallen off her shoulder when she moved. He was drunk and unsteady. The odds weren't as bad as they looked. The man stared at her. You calculated that. Briefly, she met his eyes. Are you Elias Walker? A pause. Something shifted in his face. A small recalibration. I am, he said. I'm Clara Bennett. She extended her hand. I believe you've been expecting me. He looked at her hand for just a moment, long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged something. Then he shook it. His grip was firm and dry and lasted exactly as long as necessary. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "People say that," Claire replied. "They usually stop saying it after they've known me a while." Dog. He loaded her trunk into the wagon without asking for help, which she noticed, and without commenting on how heavy it was, which she also noticed. Silas climbed up onto the bench seat beside his father and sat there in a way that told Clara the boy had learned to take up as little space as possible. The wagon rattled out of Harlan's Creek and began climbing almost immediately. The road, such as it was, wound up through stands of aspen and pine, the trees pressing closer on either side as the elevation rose. Clara sat in the wagon bed with her back against the trunk, watching the town get smaller below them. "How long is the ride?" she asked. 2 hours, Elias said, without turning around. "Weather holds." "And when it doesn't?" 3 or 4. Sometimes you don't make it at all." Clara looked up at the sky. It was clear and blue and cold, the kind of blue that comes from altitude. "Seems clear enough today." "Seems," Elias said. Silas, up on the bench, had twisted around to look at her. He was studying her face with the open intensity that young children sometimes have before they learn it's rude. "You really not scared of Harlan?" he asked. "Silas," Elias said. "It's fine," Clara said. She met the boy's eyes. "I was a little scared." Silas frowned. "Didn't look it." "Being scared and showing it are different things," Clara said. "You can be one without doing the other." The boy thought about this. Clara watched him think about it, the small forehead creasing with the effort, and thought that he was the kind of child who took things seriously. The kind who would carry whatever anyone gave him, whether it was meant for carrying or not. "My mother used to say something like that," Silas said. The word used to hung in the cold mountain air for a moment. Elias said nothing. "She sounds like she was a smart woman," Clara said carefully. Silas turned back around and didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride. The cabin was bigger than she'd expected and rougher than she'd hoped. It sat in a clearing at the edge of a tree line, backed against a ridge of rock that rose up behind it like a wall. There was a barn to one side, a shed that had partially collapsed on the other, a well in the middle of the yard, and a fence that had been repaired so many times in different places with different wood that it looked like a quilt. Smoke was coming from the chimney. A dog she had not known about came running from somewhere behind the barn, barking with the enthusiasm of an animal who either couldn't tell friend from threat or had decided it didn't matter. "Quiet," Elias said. The dog quieted. "Good," Clara thought. "At least the dog listens." She climbed down from the wagon before Elias came around to offer a hand, which she could tell mildly annoyed him without his saying so. She stood in the yard and looked at the cabin, at the window with the cracked pane on the left side, at the front step that was splitting down the middle, at the wood stacked against the wall in piles that were starting to lean, and made a private list of everything she saw. The door opened. 6 children came out, or rather 5 came out and 1 stood in the doorway. They ranged in age from what looked like 5 to about 16. The oldest was a boy, tall, wide-shouldered, with his father's flat dark eyes and an expression that was already set in the particular way of someone who has decided something in advance. Behind him came a girl of about 14, carrying a baby on her hip. Not an infant, maybe 2 years old, round-faced and solemn. Then 3 others in a rough cluster, a boy about 10, a girl around 8, and another boy who looked like he might be 6 and was trying to stand very straight and not look frightened. The baby on the girl's hip looked at Clara with the unblinking attention of the very young. "Children," Elias said. He set the brake on the wagon. "Come meet Mrs. Bennett." "Miss," Clara thought, but didn't say. They'd work out the details later. The oldest boy. He had to be Thomas, she thought. The one Elias had mentioned in his letters as the one who'd taken on the most, said nothing. He just looked at her. The look was not hostile exactly. It was something more careful than that, the kind of look that comes from expecting disappointment and wanting to identify it early. The girl with the baby said, "Hello." Polite, automatic. The greeting of someone who has learned the social forms even when they feel nothing behind them. "Hello," Clara said. She looked at all of them, taking a moment with each face. "I know this is strange. I'm a stranger to you, and this is your home, and nobody asked you whether you wanted a stranger in it." She paused. I want you to know I understand that." The little boy, who was trying not to look frightened, looked at her with sudden, sharp attention. "I'm not here to change anything that doesn't need changing," she said. "I'm just here," Thomas said from the doorway. "For how long?" It wasn't a rude question, it was a real one. That was the thing that got her. The complete absence of performance in it. He really wanted to know. He had probably watched other things leave, and he was asking the way someone asks when they've been surprised by loss before and don't intend to be surprised again. Clara looked at him steadily. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm not planning on going anywhere." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away, which was not agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. The girl with the baby, Rachel, Clara would learn, shifted the child on her hip and said quietly, "Are you hungry? There's stew on." "I am," Clara said. "Thank you." And that was how she entered the house. Dinner was an exercise in determined silence broken by the ordinary noise of 7 children eating. Clara sat where Rachel pointed her, at the end of the table opposite Elias, and she ate her stew, which was thin and oversalted and had been kept on the heat too long, and did not comment on any of it. She watched instead. She watched how Thomas ate without looking at anyone, jaw set, like eating was a task he needed to complete. She watched Rachel refill the smaller children's bowls before her own. She watched the little boy who was trying to be brave, Jonah, she'd heard someone call him, sneak glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. She watched the baby, Grace, sitting in a wooden high chair that wobbled slightly, eating with both fists and ignoring everyone. She watched Elias. He ate carefully, quietly. He answered the children's questions when they had them. Brief answers, practical answers. He wasn't cold, not exactly. He was contained, like a man who had learned to keep himself from spilling over and had gotten very good at it, and now wasn't entirely sure how to undo the habit. After dinner, when the younger children had been put to bed and Thomas had disappeared outside to check on the horses, and Rachel was washing dishes with the efficient movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times, Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Clara. She wrapped her hands around it. The cabin was cold in the way that buildings get cold when there's not enough body heat to fight the elevation. "I should tell you what I expect," Elias said. He sat across from her, not at the end of the table but at the side, which meant he was talking to her like a person and not presenting to her like an audience. "All right," Clara said. "I need someone who can cook, manage the house, help with the younger ones." He said it plainly, without apology. "Rachel's been doing most of it. She's 14. She shouldn't have to." "She shouldn't," Clara agreed. "The winters are bad," he said. "Worse than you're probably imagining. We lose animals. Sometimes we lose the road for weeks. Whatever you think you're walking into, it's harder than that." "I don't doubt it." He looked at her. There was something working behind his eyes, something he wasn't saying, and Clara had the sense of a man who was trying to decide how honest to be. "I asked for a wife," he said finally, "but I want to be clear. What I actually need is someone who'll stay. Most women who come here on these arrangements, they don't stay." Clara picked up her coffee. It was bad coffee, weak and slightly burned, and she drank it without flinching. "What happened to them?" she asked. "First one left after 2 months, said the isolation was too much." He said it without judgment. "Second one never made it past the first winter. Wrote a letter from the bottom of the mountain saying she'd changed her mind." "How many children did you have at the time?" 4. Then. Something in his face shifted briefly. "Ruth died 3 years ago. Fever. Grace was 6 months old." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, not dismissively, just accepting it as the acknowledgement it was, without needing anything more from it. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I should tell you that too." "I appreciate the honesty," Clara said. "And the children—" He stopped, looked at his cup. "They've been hurt. They don't trust easy. Thomas especially. He's decided it's his job to make sure nobody gets too comfortable before they leave." "I noticed," Clara said. "Don't take it personally." "I won't." She put her cup down. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to say something and I'd like you to hear it as plain as I mean it, not as a performance." He looked at her. "I have my own history," she said. "I have my own reasons for being here that aren't entirely uncomplicated. I'm not going to pretend I came all the way to a Colorado mountain because I had no other options and nothing better to do. She held his gaze. But I will tell you this honestly. I don't quit things. Not because I'm fearless and not because I'm optimistic, because I decided a long time ago that quitting was the one thing I was going to refuse to do. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like something breathing. Elias Walker looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said finally. It wasn't enthusiasm, it wasn't warmth, but it was something. A door left slightly open, a decision deferred rather than denied. "All right," Clara repeated. She finished her terrible coffee. Upstairs, through the ceiling, she could hear the small sounds of children sleeping. A cough, a murmur, the creak of a narrow bed. 7 lives that had learned to expect very little. Clara set down her cup and looked around the cold, rough kitchen of this cold, rough cabin on the side of this cold, rough mountain and thought, this is where I am. This is what there is. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't reassurance. But it was solid ground, and she had been without that for longer than she wanted to admit. She was still there when the fire burned low. She slept in a room not much bigger than a generous closet, on a mattress that had seen better decades, under 2 wool blankets that smelled like cedar and something older she couldn't identify. The window above the bed had a gap at the bottom corner where the frame had warped, and all night the wind came through it in a thin, persistent whistle that she couldn't entirely ignore. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't expected to. What she hadn't expected was to lie awake listening to the sounds of the house and finding them, in some strange way, almost comforting. The creak of old wood settling, the low sound of the wind outside working against the roof, the occasional murmur from one of the children's rooms down the hall, a dream speaking itself out loud before fading back into silence. These were the sounds of a house that was occupied, lived in, still going. She got up before the sun. The kitchen was cold in the way that kitchens get when the fire has been out for hours, a specific cold that lives in the floor and the walls and takes a long time to argue with. Clara built the fire herself, working quietly, learning the temperament of the stove, which was old in particular and required a specific sequence of damper and kindling that she figured out mostly by trial and some brief, silent frustration. By the time the first light was coming gray through the east window, she had the fire going, water heating, and was looking through the pantry shelves with a pragmatic eye. The pantry told her a lot. There was enough. That was the first thing. They weren't going hungry, which she had quietly worried about on the wagon ride up, but enough was doing a lot of work. The flour barrel was getting low. The dried beans were plentiful but monotonous. There were 3 jars of preserved tomatoes that Rachel had put up. Clara could tell by the slightly uneven lids, the marks of someone who had learned canning from observation rather than instruction. There was salted pork, cornmeal, some root vegetables that needed to be used within the week before they went soft. There was almost no sugar and no shortage of coffee, which told her something about Elias Walker's personal priorities. She made biscuits. It was the most useful thing she could think of, and it gave her hands something to do while her mind got itself organized. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:20, still pulling her hair back, and stopped when she saw Clara at the stove. "You didn't have to," she started. "I know," Clara said. "Sit down. You look like you haven't slept enough." Rachel's expression did something complicated. She was 14, but she carried herself like someone who had learned early that the luxury of looking tired was not something she could afford. She sat down at the kitchen table slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. "I usually have the biscuits started by now," Rachel said. "Now you don't have to." Clara slid the pan into the oven and turned around. "How long have you been running this kitchen?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Since Mama died. Thomas helped some at the beginning, but he had to take over the animals, so." She shrugged one shoulder. "It fell to me." "You've been doing a good job," Clara said. "The biscuits come out wrong sometimes." "Everyone's biscuits come out wrong sometimes." Clara leaned against the counter. "I'm not here to criticize what you've been doing. You've been holding this family together. That's not a small thing." Rachel looked at her. The girl had her father's dark eyes and a way of looking at things directly. that was either natural confidence or the result of having no time left for indirectness. People say things like that, she said carefully, and then they find something that's wrong. I'm sure I will, Clara said honestly, but not about this. A pause. The biscuits smell different, Rachel said. I use a little more butter when I can get it. Does your father keep butter? Sometimes. From the Hendersons down the valley, they have dairy cows. Then we'll see about getting some regularly. Clara pulled 2 cups down from the shelf and poured the coffee. She set one in front of Rachel without asking whether she wanted it. Tell me about the others. While it's quiet. Rachel wrapped both hands around the cup, the gesture of someone who had learned that warmth was worth holding on to, and told her. Thomas was 16 and had decided at some point in the last 3 years that sentiment was a thing he couldn't afford. He did the work of a grown man and resented being treated like a child, but also underneath that was still frightened in ways he would never say out loud. He had been the one to find their mother when she died. He hadn't talked about it to anyone. Jonah was 10, the one who had been trying to stand up straight in the yard. He had nightmares. Not every night, but often enough that Rachel had learned to listen for the particular kind of quiet that came before them. Hannah was 8, the girl in the cluster who had her mother's coloring, lighter than the others, freckled across the nose. She had mostly stopped talking for about 6 months after Ruth died and had started again gradually, but she still went silent when things felt uncertain. The twins, Isaac and Eli, were 6, identical except for a scar Eli had on his chin from a fall 2 years ago. They were the loudest of the children and the ones most likely to be found somewhere they weren't supposed to be. And Grace was 2, and didn't understand enough to have been shaped by grief yet, which was either a mercy or just a postponement. Rachel wasn't sure which. She looks like Mama, Rachel said at the end about Grace. She said it quietly and without any particular expression, the way you say something you've made your peace with, even though the peace is incomplete. She's lucky she has you, Clara said. Rachel looked up. That's what people say when they don't know what else to say. Clara almost smiled. You're right. What I mean is, your mother would be glad you've been here for her. That's different. Rachel considered this. Maybe, she said. The biscuits were done. Clara pulled them out and the smell of them moved through the kitchen like a proper announcement, and within 5 minutes there were small feet on the stairs. But the first week was not easy, and she hadn't thought it would be. Thomas spoke to her in the careful minimum. Yes, no, I'll see to it, and disappeared outside whenever the house got too full of her presence. Clara didn't push him. She understood that she was an intrusion, regardless of how invited she technically was, and that the only way through that particular wall was patience, which she had in larger supply than most people would have guessed from looking at her. Jonah watched her. He did it sideways, from across rooms, the way animals watch something new before deciding whether it's dangerous. She caught him once standing outside the partially open door of the room where she'd set up her things, looking at the trunk. When he realized she'd seen him, he disappeared with a speed that told her he'd had practice at vanishing. She didn't mention it. But the next morning, when he came down for breakfast, she said, without looking up from the stove, "It belonged to my father, the trunk. He was a doctor." Jonah stopped moving. "I used to help him sometimes," she said, still not looking at him. "Cleaning instruments, mostly. Sometimes more. He believed that knowing how things worked was better than being afraid of them." A long pause, then, "What happened to him?" "He died," Clara said simply. "A few years ago." "Oh." Another pause. "Is that why you came here?" She glanced at him then. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen floor in his socks, holding his suspenders up with both hands, looking at her with the kind of direct curiosity that adults spend years learning to suppress. "Partly," she said. "Why do you ask?" "Thomas says people come here because they've got nowhere else to go," Jonah said. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. "Thomas isn't wrong," she said carefully. "But I want you to understand something. Having nowhere else to go and choosing where you are, those can sometimes be the same thing, depending on how you look at it." Jonah's forehead did that crease again, the one she'd seen on his face in the wagon. "That doesn't make sense." "Probably not yet," Clara agreed, "but hold on to it. He did not run that morning when breakfast was ready. He sat at the table in his usual spot, and when she set the plate in front of him, he said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely a whisper but was clearly deliberate. It was a small thing. She treated it like one. Hannah presented a different kind of difficulty, which was the difficulty of a child who had learned to wait and see. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't distant in the way Thomas was distant. She simply observed, with an 8-year-old's frank and tireless assessment, and did not yet seem to have reached a verdict. On the 4th day, Clara found her sitting on the split front step with a piece of string, working at some sort of knot with the fierce concentration of a child who has set herself a problem. "That's a hard one," Clara said, sitting down beside her. Hannah didn't look up. "I'm making a cat's cradle." Rachel said she knew how, but she forgot. "I know how," Clara said. Hannah looked up then. "Really?" "My father taught me. He said it was good for hand dexterity." She paused. "Good for your fingers, for being precise." "Can you show me?" She showed her. It took most of an hour sitting on that cold step with the wind coming down off the mountain, Hannah's small hands moving inside the string with the focused effort of someone learning a new language. Clara's hands moved slowly, demonstrating, talking through each step without impatience, waiting while Hannah's fingers figured out what her eyes already understood. By the end, Hannah hadn't quite gotten it. The string kept collapsing at the 3rd step, falling into a tangle. "It's not working," Hannah said, frustrated. "Not yet," Clara said. "It'll work tomorrow, or the day after." "What if it doesn't?" "Then we'll figure out what you're doing different and adjust." Clara looked at her. "Things that take practice always feel wrong before they feel right. That's not failure. That's just the middle part." Hannah stared at the tangled string in her hands. "Mama used to say things like that," she said. "Not sad, exactly. More like reporting a fact." "What kinds of things did she say?" Clara asked. And Hannah talked. For the first time, not to Rachel, not to Jonah, but to this stranger sitting on the step beside her, Hannah talked about her mother. Small things. The way Ruth sang when she thought no one was listening. The smell of the particular soap she used. A story about a summer afternoon and a wild strawberry patch, and coming home with stained mouths that no one could pretend weren't there. Clara listened. She did not try to fill the silence when Hannah paused. She did not say she sounds wonderful or you must miss her so much. She simply listened, which was the one thing she could give the girl that nobody else had thought to. When Hannah finally ran out of words and went quiet, Clara said, "Thank you for telling me that." "Why are you thanking me?" "Because you didn't have to," Clara said, "and you did anyway." Hannah looked at her for a long moment with those careful, assessing eyes. Then she went inside for supper, and she didn't run, and she held the door open behind her without being asked. "What?" Thomas took longer. She had known he would. He was civil enough in the way that a controlled person is civil, meeting the requirements of basic decency without offering anything beyond them. He answered questions directly and didn't make trouble and helped with the work without being asked twice, because he had learned long ago that things needed doing whether he felt like doing them or not. But he also watched her with that careful early warning system he'd built, waiting for the thing that would confirm what he already believed, which was that she was temporary, that she would find the mountain too hard or the isolation too complete, or the family too damaged, and she would write a letter from the bottom of the road like the last one had. She let him watch. There was nothing she could say to a 16-year-old boy who had found his mother dead that would mean anything. Words didn't close that particular kind of wound. Only time did, and only if you didn't leave. What changed things, finally, was the fence. It happened on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after her arrival. Clara was bringing water up from the well when she heard the sound of Thomas struggling with something around the side of the barn. She came around the corner and found him trying to restring a section of the wire fence that had come down in the night, trying to do it alone, which meant holding the wire taut with one hand and driving the staple with the other, which was about a half-inch short of physically possible. He heard her approach and didn't look up. "I've got it," he said. "You don't," Clara said. "Not by yourself. Hold that side." A pause. The wire sagged. Thomas looked at her with an expression that was simultaneously annoyed and calculating, weighing whether accepting help was worth it. "Hold it," she said again. Practical. Not a request, not a command, just the obvious next step. He held it. They worked in silence for a while. Clara had learned fences the same way she'd learned most practical things, from watching, from reading, from the kind of doing it wrong that teaches you faster than anyone telling you the right way. She'd helped her father fix the fence around his property outside Philadelphia more times than she could count. She knew the difference between a staple that would hold and one that was just pretending. "You've done this before," Thomas said. It came out surprised, involuntarily, like he hadn't meant to say it. "Some," Clara said. "Not mountain fencing specifically, but the principles transfer." Another silence. The wire went taut. Clara drove the staple, tested it, moved to the next post. "Where'd you come from?" Thomas asked. Still not looking at her, asking the fence. "Boston, most recently," Clara said. "Before that, Philadelphia." "Why'd you leave Philadelphia?" She kept working. "Things went wrong," she said. "In my work. I needed somewhere that wasn't there." He considered this. "What kind of work?" "Medical?" She paused, her hand on the wire stretcher. "I trained as a doctor. It didn't end the way I'd hoped." Thomas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different. Not warm, but lesser armored. "Does my father know that?" "Not yet," she said. "There's a lot your father and I haven't had time to say to each other." "Are you going to tell him?" "Eventually." She looked at him then. "Are you going to?" Something shifted in his face. The question surprised him. That she'd turn it back. That she'd treat him like someone whose answer mattered. "No," he said. "That's not my business to tell." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said quickly, not wanting the moment to be more than it was. I'm not saying I trust you. I'm just saying it's not mine to tell." "Fair enough," Clara said. They finished the fence in another 20 minutes. When they were done, Thomas gathered the tools without being asked and put them back where they belonged and walked away without ceremony, the way he did everything. But when he passed her on his way to the barn, he said, so quietly she almost missed it, "It's a good fix." 3 words. About a fence. She filed them away like they were worth something, because they were. Garson. The trouble with Elias was different from the trouble with the children. The children were grieving and cautious and testing her. Elias was doing something that she found harder to navigate, which was that he was trying very hard to be fair. He was scrupulously fair. He made sure she had what she needed. He asked briefly each evening if anything required his attention. He carried the heavy things without being asked and fixed the window gap in her bedroom wall without mentioning it, so that one morning she simply woke up and the whistle of wind was gone. He was not unkind. He was not cold, not exactly. He was somewhere else. She saw it most clearly in the evenings, when the children had gone to bed and the kitchen was quiet. He would sit with his coffee and look at the table, or the fire, or the middle distance, some point that wasn't quite in the room. There was a man thinking something in there, working on something privately, and he had gotten so practiced at keeping it private that he'd forgotten, maybe, that there were other people in the room who could see the process even if they couldn't hear it. She didn't press him. She wasn't sure she had the right yet, but she watched, the same way she watched everything, because watching was what you did when you didn't yet have enough information. It was on a Saturday, in the 3rd week, that she asked him the question. They were sitting at opposite ends of the kitchen, she at the table with some mending, he near the fire with an inventory list he'd been working on for the past half hour without seeming to make much progress on it. The twins had finally gone to sleep after a long campaign of resistance. Grace was down. The house was quiet. "Were you happy?" Claire said. "Before." Elias looked up. "Before what?" "Before Ruth died." She kept her eyes on the mending. "Were you happy in the way people mean when they say happy? Or was it more like working, like something that worked?" A long pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, which was his right. "Both," he said finally. "At different times." "That's honest." "You asked an honest question." She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the assessing look and not the contained look, but something more uncertain, like a man standing at the edge of a conversation he wasn't sure he wanted to have. "Is this your way of asking me something about us?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still figuring out what questions I have." "Well," he looked back at the fire, "when you figure them out, you can ask them." It wasn't an invitation to closeness. It wasn't a door swinging wide open, but it was, she thought, a key left on the table, within reach if she wanted it. She went back to the mending. He went back to his list, or the pretense of it. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with that sound she was starting to recognize. Not the sharp whistle of a gap in a window frame, but something broader and more patient, like breathing. The sound of something that had been there long before any of them, and would be there long after. It wasn't comfort, but she was beginning to think that comfort wasn't actually the thing she'd come here for. She'd come for something harder and more durable than comfort. She was starting to think she might have found the right place for it. The first snow came on a Wednesday night in early November, and it came without the courtesy of a warning. Clara had noticed the sky changing through the kitchen window around supper. The particular shade of gray that she was learning to read, a flat, pressurized gray that sat lower than ordinary clouds. But she hadn't known yet what it meant. She was still learning the mountain's language. The sky in Colorado spoke differently than the sky in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, and she was still working out the translation. By midnight, there was a foot on the ground. By morning, there were two, and the wind had arranged it against the north side of the barn in a drift that came halfway up the door. She heard Elias get up at 4 in the morning. She heard him pull on his boots in the dark and go out without lighting a lamp, which meant he knew the yard well enough to walk it blind. She heard Thomas follow 20 minutes later. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to them working out there in the dark and the snow, and she thought about the pantry. What was in it? What wasn't? What they would need if the road down the mountain stayed closed. When she came down and built the fire at 5, she had already made a list in her head. She spent the morning taking stock. Elias came in twice, once to warm his hands, once for coffee. And each time he found her in a different corner of the cabin, looking at something or writing in the small notebook she'd started keeping. He didn't ask what she was doing. He was a man who understood the value of letting people work. It was on the second visit that she showed him the notebook. "We have enough flour for about 2 more weeks at current use," she said, holding it open. "The salt pork is fine, but if this storm keeps the road closed past 10 days, we'll have problems with the root vegetables. They need to come inside to a warmer place or we'll lose them. And the twins are going through cornmeal faster than I'd accounted for." Elias looked at the notebook. He looked at it the way people look at something that surprises them. Not dramatically, but with a small adjustment happening behind the eyes. "I usually keep a count in my head," he said. "A written count doesn't forget," Clara said, "and it doesn't have to recalculate every time something changes." He was quiet for a moment. "The root vegetables," he said. "There's space under the main stairs. It's warmer there than the root cellar when the temperature drops this fast." "I'll move them this afternoon," she said. "Thomas can—" "I can do it," she said. Not sharp, just clear. He looked at her again with that same recalibrating look she was beginning to recognize. It was the look of a man updating his understanding of something, making a small correction to a map he'd drawn too quickly. "All right," he said. He went back out. Clara went back to her list. The storm lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, the cabin became a different kind of place. Smaller, denser, the 8 of them pressed together by weather and circumstance into a forced intimacy that was sometimes warm and sometimes grating, and mostly just real. The twins argued over everything and nothing. Hannah retreated into a book she'd read twice already. Jonah found a project involving a length of rope and a series of knots that kept him occupied for most of 2 days. Rachel managed Grace with the tireless pragmatism of a girl who had been doing it so long she no longer noticed she was doing it. Thomas shoveled. He went out every 3 or 4 hours and cleared the paths, to the barn, to the well, to the woodpile, with the methodical intensity of a person who needs physical labor the way other people need air. Clara watched him from the window sometimes, this 16-year-old boy throwing snow with his whole body in the way men do when they're working something out that they can't put into words. On the third evening, when the fire was burning low and the children were in bed, Elias sat down across from Clara with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not closed, not distant, something tired and slightly unguarded, the way people get when they've been keeping it together for 3 days straight and the effort is starting to show at the edges. "Corwin's man came by 2 weeks before you arrived," he said, without preamble. The way he said it suggested he'd been deciding whether to say it for some time. Clara looked up from her mending. "Which Corwin?" "Silas Corwin, banker, down in Harlan's Creek. Has his fingers in most of the property in this valley." He said it without heat, but the flatness of his voice was doing work. "He's been acquiring land up here the past 3 years, foreclosures mostly. Some of them legitimate, some of them less so. And his man came to see you, came to tell me the promissory note I signed 4 years ago to cover Ruth's medical costs has been transferred to Corwin's bank, and that the interest has been accumulating in ways I wasn't told about when I signed it." He looked at his hands. They were rough hands, the kind that told their own story. "The total they're claiming I owe is more than this property is worth." Clara set down the mending. "Can I see the original note?" "I've got it. What's left of it. The copy I kept." "I'd like to look at it." He studied her for a moment. "You know how to read a promissory note?" "My father had a practice for 30 years, she said. "He dealt with medical billing, insurance arrangements, institutional debts. I kept his books for him the last 8 years of his life." She held his gaze. "I know how to read a financial document." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll get it," he said. He brought her the note and she read it twice, slowly, in the way her father had taught her. Not for what it said plainly, but for what it left out. For the spaces between clauses where things could be inserted later. For the language that seemed clear until you looked at it from a different angle. She didn't say anything while she read. Elias sat across from her and drank his coffee and didn't ask. When she looked up, she said, "The interest clause is written to allow compounding on a schedule that isn't specified. That's intentional. It means whoever holds this note can apply whatever schedule benefits them most." Can they do that? If nobody challenges it, yes. She set the paper down. Has anyone besides Corwin's representative ever looked at this? "No lawyer in Harlan's Creek is going to take my case against Corwin," Elias said. "He owns half of them and has business with the other half." "The nearest federal office," Clara said. "Where is it?" 3 hours down the mountain when the road is good." He looked at the window where the snow was still coming down. "When it's not, it might as well be another country." Clara was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow fell without any particular concern for their problems. "We have time before the thaw," she said. "I want to understand the full extent of what he's claiming before we do anything. Can you tell me everything, every interaction you've had with his office, every document they've sent, everything you remember about the original arrangement?" Elias looked at her. The look was not the recalibrating look this time. It was something more direct than that, something that was trying to figure out what it was seeing. "You're not just asking to understand," he said. "No," Clara said. "What are you planning to do?" She picked up the note and folded it carefully along its original creases. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'd rather have the information before I need it than after." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, looking for the same gap it always looked for. "I'll tell you what I know," he said. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. It was Grace who got sick. Not during the storm, after it, when the snow had settled and the world had gone quiet and white, and everyone had exhaled and started thinking the worst was past. It happened the way illness in very young children often happens, which is quickly and without adequate warning. One morning, Grace woke up fussy and warm. By afternoon, she was hot in a way that wasn't ordinary, her small face flushed and her breathing faster than it should have been. Rachel noticed first. She brought Grace down from the nap that hadn't helped and stood in the kitchen doorway with the toddler on her hip and her own face carefully neutral in the way she went neutral when she was frightened and didn't want the younger ones to see it. "She's been like this since noon," Rachel said. "I thought it would pass." Clara crossed the room and put her hand on Grace's forehead immediately, then on the back of her neck. Then she turned the child gently to look at her eyes, her color, the small, rapid movement of her chest. Her own chest went tight. The fever was high enough. Grace's breathing had a quality Clara recognized from things she wished she didn't know. A slight labor to each inhale, a faint catch that didn't belong there. "Lay her down in my room," Clara said. "On the bed. Bring me the coldest water you can draw from the well and clean cloth." Rachel didn't ask questions. That was one of the things about Rachel. When things became serious, she operated. Clara went to her room. She stood in front of the trunk for just a moment. She hadn't opened it since arriving. She had told herself she wouldn't need to. She had packed it and brought it because she couldn't bring herself to leave it. Couldn't bring herself to leave her father's things in a storage room in Boston where they would eventually be disposed of by strangers. But she had also told herself that that part of her life was finished, that she had closed it the way you close a door when you know you're not supposed to go back in. She opened the trunk. The smell came first, a particular combination of wood and metal and something antiseptic that was the smell of her father's office, the smell of her entire education, of 15 years of learning and the one night that had undone all of it. She breathed through it. She found what she needed, the medical bag, the stethoscope, the collection of carefully labeled bottles her father had accumulated over decades of practice, and she carried them to the bed where Rachel had laid Grace down. Grace looked up at her with glassy, too bright eyes. "Hey," Clara said softly. "I've got you." She worked. She worked with the particular focus that comes from training that goes deep enough to operate underneath panic, the kind her father had drilled into her through repetition and correction and the relentless insistence that precision mattered more than speed. She listened to Grace's chest. She assessed. She thought. It was pneumonia. Early stage, she was fairly certain. The chest was not yet compromised the way it would be further in, and the child's color, though poor, was not the color of something that had gone too far. But early stage wasn't the same as manageable without intervention, not at this altitude, not in a 2-year-old with a fever this high. Elias appeared in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd come in from the barn. He was standing with snow still on his boots, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, which was that it had lost its containment entirely. He looked like a man who had already lost someone in a room that looked exactly like this one. "What is it?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Pneumonia, I think." She didn't look up from Grace. "I need to bring the fever down first, then I need to keep her airways clear and watch her breathing through the night." "You're certain it's—" "I'm not certain of anything," Claire said, "but I know what I'm doing. I need you to trust that and stay out of my way." A silence. She heard him breathing from the doorway. "What do you need?" he said. "The water Rachel brought. More cloth. If you have eucalyptus oil or camphor anywhere in this house, I need it now." "Cabinet in the barn," he said. "Ruth kept some for the horses." "Get it." He went. She worked through the late afternoon and into the evening. Rachel stayed close, following Clara's instructions with a quiet competence that kept making Clara think the girl had steadier hands than most adults she'd worked beside. Thomas appeared at some point and took the younger children to the other side of the cabin and kept them there, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she didn't have to ask him. Jonah sat outside the door of her room for an hour. She could hear him there, not moving, not making a sound. And eventually Elias came and told him quietly to come eat something, and the sound of his footsteps moving away felt like something tightening in her chest that she couldn't afford to feel right now. She kept working. The fever began to respond around 9 o'clock, not dropping, not yet, but the sharp upward trend leveled out, which was something. Grace had fallen into a restless sleep, her small chest rising and falling with that slight labor that Clara kept her eyes on the way you watch a fire you're not sure is contained. Elias came back around 10 and stood in the doorway again. He'd changed his boots. His face was still undone in that way, but there was something else in it now, some quality of a man who has decided to be present for whatever is coming regardless of what it is. "Has she been worse?" he asked quietly. "No," Claire said. "She's held." He came into the room then, something he'd been not doing all evening, giving her space, keeping to the doorway, and he sat down on the small chair in the corner and looked at his daughter sleeping.
The last time I sat in a room like this, he said, I walked out without her mother. Clara didn't say anything. I know it's not the same thing, he said. I know Grace is... He stopped. I just needed to be in here. I know, Clara said. They sat in silence for a while. The lamp burned low. Outside, the night was clear and very cold. The post-storm cold that goes deeper than the storm itself because the clouds are gone, and there's nothing between the ground and the sky. You trained as a doctor, Elias said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. It was the sound of a man putting something together. Yes, Clara said. Thomas told me. A pause. He said you'd told him. She nodded, not turning from Grace. Why didn't you tell me? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because it comes with a story I wasn't ready to tell, she said, and because I was hoping I wouldn't need to use it. The trunk, he said. Yes. Another silence. Grace made a small sound in her sleep, and Clara was at her side immediately, hand on the small forehead, and the fever had come down. Not gone, but down. She let out a breath that she'd been holding in pieces for the past 6 hours. She's coming down, Claire said. She heard Elias exhale behind her. A single, complete breath released all at once, the kind that carries something with it when it goes. Clara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name without any hesitation in it. She turned. He was looking at her in a way he hadn't looked at her before. Not the assessing look, not the fair and measured look of a man trying to be just in his dealings. Something more exposed than that. Something that hadn't been intended to be seen, but had come out anyway because a man sitting in a room where his youngest daughter is sick, and the woman he barely knows is the one keeping her alive, doesn't have the reserves left to keep everything properly organized. Thank you, he said. Just that. But the wait in it was not a simple wait. Don't thank me yet, she said. We've got a long night. I know, he said. I'll stay. You should sleep. I'll stay, he said again, quiet and final. So he stayed. Clara worked through the night in the way she had been trained to, checking and reassessing and adjusting, watching Grace's breathing with a vigilance she had not allowed herself to call what it actually was, which was devotion. This child she had known for less than a month, this small, round-faced girl who ate with both fists and looked at everyone with that unblinking solemnity. Clara had not planned to love any of these children. She had planned to be useful and decent and steady, which she thought was more honest and more sustainable than love, which could arrive and then leave damage behind it. But somewhere in the night, in the small hours when Grace's fever broke properly and the child sighed in her sleep, a long, settling sigh, the sigh of a small body releasing something it had been holding very hard. Somewhere in that moment, Clara understood that the plan had already failed. Not in a bad way. By morning, Grace was cooler. Her breathing had evened out into something that sounded like an ordinary 2-year-old sleeping, which was one of the better sounds Clara had ever heard in her life. When she woke, she looked at Clara with those serious dark eyes and said, with the clarity and conviction of the very young, "Biscuit." Clara laughed. It came out sudden and unplanned, a real laugh, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a second because it surprised her. Elias, who had dozed in the chair and woken when Grace spoke, looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't fully name, somewhere between relief and something else, something slower and less immediate than relief. "Biscuit," he repeated. "It appears so," Clara said. He looked at his daughter, who was now sitting up and looking entirely unbothered by her night of illness, with the resilient indifference of small children who recover and then immediately want breakfast. "I'll get the fire started," Elias said. He passed Clara in the doorway and he stopped, briefly, standing close in the narrow space. "The story," he said quietly, "the one that came with the trunk. When you're ready." She looked at him. "It's not a good story." "I didn't think it would be," he said. "That's not why I want to hear it." He went to start the fire. Clara stood for a moment in the doorway of the room where Grace was demanding biscuits with the authority of someone who had just survived something and expected to be rewarded for it, and she thought about the trunk, open now, in the corner of the room.
The tools laid out, the bottles organized, the journals stacked. All of it visible for the first time since Boston. It looked less like a wound than she remembered. She wasn't sure yet what it looked like instead. But she picked up the stethoscope from the bedside table and held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Her father's hands, her father's work, her father's belief that knowledge was not something to be afraid of, and something in her that had been held at a particular tension for 3 years loosened, just slightly. Not gone. Not resolved. Just different than before. She went to make the biscuits. She didn't know it yet, but while she'd been working through the night to save Grace, Silas Corwin had sent another letter. It was sitting in the post at the bottom of the mountain, waiting for the road to clear. Inside it, written in the precise and pleasant handwriting of a man who understood that the most dangerous demands are the ones that sound perfectly reasonable, was a notice of final intent to foreclose on the Walker property, with a deadline that left them less time than she'd thought. The mountain didn't care about that. The mountain was white and cold and entirely indifferent, the way it always was. But Clara was starting to understand that indifference and patience were not the same thing. The mountain waited because it could afford to. She was beginning to think she could not. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried up the mountain by a boy from town who looked about 13 and very unhappy about the road conditions. He handed it to Elias at the door and left without waiting for a response, which told Clara something about the letter before it was opened, that the boy had made this kind of delivery before, and had learned that it was better not to be present for what came after. Elias read it standing in the doorway, cold air coming in around him, and Clara watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. Not the loss of containment she'd seen the night of Grace's fever, something harder and quieter than that. The face of a man receiving news he had already half expected, and had been hoping in some private corner of himself, was wrong. He brought the letter inside and set it on the table without a word. Clara read it. The language was careful, polished, the kind of writing that costs money. Every sentence structured to sound both reasonable and inevitable, to suggest that the matter had already been decided by forces larger than either party, and that the deadline of 32 days was not Corwin's choice, but simply the regrettable conclusion of a process that Elias himself had set in motion by defaulting. There was even a line near the bottom that expressed what appeared to be sympathy for the family's difficulty, which Clara found to be the most dishonest sentence on a page full of dishonest sentences. She set it down. 32 days, she said. Road's only been clear a week, Elias said. He was standing at the window with his back to her, which was how he handled things he needed a moment with. Which means he sent this before the thaw. He'd already written it. He'd already decided, Clara said. The letter was the formality. Elias turned around. I can't get 32 days' worth of money together in 32 days. I can't get it together in 32 months at what this land produces. He said it flat and without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. He knows that. He's counting on it, Clara said. She picked up the letter again and read it a second time, slower. She was looking for something specific, a name, a reference, any indication of the chain of hands the original note had passed through before it reached Corwin's bank. There was a name at the bottom, beneath Corwin's signature, a secondary signatory notarized. Robert Deakins, accounts manager. Who is Robert Deakins? She asked. Elias frowned. Is now at the bank that purchased that loan and is using the vague interest clause to foreclose. She set the letter down. That's not a coincidence. That's a mechanism. Elias looked at her. What do you mean, a mechanism? I mean someone moved the pieces, Clara said. Deakins arranged a loan with language that could be exploited. The loan was sold to Corwin's bank, probably not just yours, probably several like it. And now Deakins is there to help execute the foreclosures, because he understands the documents better than anyone. She paused. He'd also understand, better than anyone, what the original intent was, what was done deliberately and what wasn't. You think he'd talk? I think he might, Clara said carefully, depending on what he stands to lose and what he's already been asked to do. Elias was quiet for a long time. The fire settled in the hearth. Somewhere upstairs, Grace was doing something that involved intermittent thumping, which Clara had come to recognize as her dragging her wooden pull toy across the floor. Clara, Elias said. He said her name the same way he had the night of Grace's fever, without the slight hesitation that had been there at the beginning, when she'd been a stranger in his kitchen and he'd been trying to be fair about something he didn't yet know how to categorize. "What is it you're thinking of doing?" "I want to go to Harlan's Creek," she said. "I want to find Robert Deakins." "And say what to him?" "I don't know yet exactly," she said, "but I know how to talk to a man who has done something he isn't proud of. You ask the right questions, and then you stop talking and let him fill the silence." She looked at Elias directly. "I also want to go to Corwin's bank." A pause. "That's not a good idea." "Probably not," she agreed, "but I want to see it. I want to see what his operation looks like, who works there, who comes in, how the books are displayed in the window." She saw the look on his face and said, "I'm not going to do anything reckless. I'm going to look. Looking is information. He'll know who you are." "I'm counting on it," she said. She told him the story that night, the one she'd promised, the one that came with the trunk. They sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and she told it the way she had never told it to anyone in its complete form. Not the shortened version she'd given to landlords and employers, not the version she'd told herself in the 2 years of trying to get past it, but the actual story, which was longer and more complicated and did not resolve itself into a clean lesson the way people sometimes wanted hard stories to resolve. She had been 27. She had been working as a physician's assistant in a hospital in Philadelphia, which was the highest position available to a woman with her training in a city that preferred its female medical professionals to stay in designated lanes. She had been good at it. She had been better than good, and the people around her had known it. And this had produced a mixture of genuine respect and the specific resentment that comes from people who know they are being outperformed by someone they expected to perform less. There had been a patient, a boy, 9 years old, brought in with what presented initially as a severe respiratory infection. Clara had assessed him. She had disagreed with the attending physician's initial treatment plan, had said so clearly, had documented her concerns, had been overruled by a man who had been practicing medicine for 22 years and did not appreciate being contradicted by someone who had been doing it for 5. The boy had died 3 days later. Her documented disagreement, rather than becoming evidence of her correct judgment, became the thing they used against her. A young woman who had challenged a senior physician, who had created a paper trail of institutional conflict. Who could be blamed in the retelling for the confusion of treatment, for the uncertainty that the conflicting opinions had allegedly caused? She had not been formally charged with anything. That was the thing about institutional blame. It rarely needed formal charges. It needed only reputation, and reputation needed only suggestion, and suggestion traveled faster than any documentation she could produce in her own defense. She left Philadelphia 8 months later. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Elias had not interrupted once. He sat with his coffee gone cold in front of him and looked at her with the same focused stillness he brought to everything. And when she stopped talking, he didn't immediately say anything, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "The doctor," he said finally. "The senior one. Was he disciplined?" "No," Clara said. Did anyone?" "No," she said again. That's how it works sometimes. The institution protects itself. The person who was right but didn't have the authority to be right, they absorb it. Elias was quiet again. Then he said, "That's why you closed the trunk." "That's why I closed the trunk," she said. "And why you opened it anyway." She looked at the table. "Grace didn't care about my history," she said. "She was just sick, and I knew how to help." She paused. "My father used to say that knowledge is not something you get to retire. It stays with you whether you want it to or not. At some point you either use it or you spend the rest of your life pretending you don't have it." Elias reached across the table and picked up the foreclosure letter and looked at it again. "Then use it," he said. "Whatever you're thinking about doing with Corwin, use it." "I need you to trust me," she said, "even when I don't fully explain every step." "You saved my daughter," he said. "That buys some trust." "I don't want it to be about that," she said quickly. "That's not Clara." His voice was patient. "I know. I'm not keeping score." He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you, I trust you. Just take it. She took it. Antieb. She went down the mountain 4 days later. Elias drove her to the edge of town and waited with the wagon at the far end of the main street, which had been her request. She wanted to move through Harlan's Creek on her own terms and at her own pace, and having a man waiting for her was not the same as having a man accompany her, which was a distinction that mattered. She had dressed deliberately that morning, not to impress and not to intimidate, but to be overlooked. A plain dark coat, her hair simply done, nothing about her appearance that asked to be noticed. In her bag, she carried her notebook, the copy of the promissory note, and 3 of her father's financial journals, specifically the ones that contained his analysis of similar loan instruments from a decade ago, cases he had consulted on as a favor to a colleague who ran a legal practice in New Jersey. She went to the bank first. Corwin's Bank occupied the largest building on the main street, 3 stories, brick-faced, with a name in gold lettering above the door that had been recently repainted. The kind of building that was designed to communicate permanence, to say, we have been here and will continue to be here, regardless of what becomes of you. She went inside and stood near the window and looked at things. She counted the employees she could see. She noted the arrangement of the office space, where the account books were kept, who had access to the back room, where a man of authority would sit if he wanted to observe everything without being in the center of things. She watched the customers. She watched who Corwin's staff spoke to with deference and who they spoke to with the particular careful pleasantness reserved for people they wanted something from. She was there for 12 minutes. Nobody spoke to her. A woman standing near a window looking at the street was not, apparently, a cause for concern. She left and went to find Robert Deakins. He was not hard to find. In a town the size of Harlan's Creek, everyone knew where everyone worked, and a brief conversation with the woman running the dry goods counter, conducted under the pretext of asking about postal arrangements, yielded the information that the accounts manager at Corwin's Bank took his lunch at the same place every day at noon. Clara was there at 11:50. The lunch counter was a narrow room attached to the back of the hotel, 6 tables, no windows to speak of, the kind of place that survived on habit rather than quality. She took the table in the corner and ordered coffee and waited. Deakins arrived at noon exactly, which told her something about him. A man who kept precise time was a man who liked order. A man who liked order was a man who was uncomfortable with disorder, with things that didn't fit the expected shape. She let him sit down in order before she moved. When she crossed to his table and sat down across from him without being invited, he looked up with the expression of a man whose ordered world had just been interrupted. "Mr. Deakins," she said, "my name is Clara Walker. I'm Elias Walker's wife." His face did something quick and complicated that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. "Mrs. Walker," he said. His voice was careful. "I don't think this is the appropriate place to—" "You arranged the original loan for my husband 4 years ago," Clara said. "Through Hargrove's lending office. You drafted the interest clause yourself. I'd like to talk to you about that clause." I don't discuss client business in— "You're not his lender anymore," Clara said. "You transferred that relationship when you moved to Corwin's Bank, so you're not discussing client business. You're discussing your own professional history." He looked at her. He was a man in his late 40s, neat, the kind of neat that was maintained deliberately, with eyes that were watchful and a mouth that had learned to stay still. "What is it you want?" he said quietly. "The truth about the interest clause," she said. "I've read it. My father was a physician who spent 30 years managing institutional finances. He taught me how to read documents like that one." She held Deacon's gaze. "The clause was written to be exploitable. You know it was. I think there's a version of events where you didn't fully anticipate how it would be used, and I think there's a version where you did. What I don't know yet is which version is true." Deakins said nothing, but he hadn't left. "Mr. Deakins," Clara said, and she kept her voice level and without judgment, which was a skill she had learned from her father, who had always said that accusation closes doors and curiosity opens them. "I don't think you set out to put a family off their land. I think you wrote a clause that someone else decided to exploit, and now you're at a bank where your job requires you to execute something you may not be entirely comfortable with." She paused. "I could be wrong." A long silence. The lunch counter was filling up around them. the sounds of ordinary noon business, orders being called, chairs being pulled out, two men in the corner arguing about fence pricing. Deacons looked down at his untouched coffee. There were 7 loans, he said, so quietly she had to lean slightly forward to hear him, written with that same clause. All of them went to Hargrove's. All of them were sold inside of 18 months to Corwin's bank. He stopped. I wrote the clause the way I was asked to write it. I told myself it was standard. By the time I understood what it was going to be used for, I was already working for the man using it. Clara let that sit for a moment without touching it. There are records, she said carefully, of the original loan arrangements, of the sale to Corwin, of the interest calculations they've applied versus what the clause actually stipulates. Yes, Deacon said. Are those records accessible? He looked up at her. His face had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight had stopped feeling remarkable, and who had just been asked for the first time whether he wanted to put it down. If someone knew where to look, he said. Tell me where to look, Clara said. He told her. Not everything, not that day, but enough. Enough to know what existed, where it was kept, and what it would prove if someone with the right knowledge examined it. He told her in the careful, qualified language of a man who was not yet fully committed to anything, but was testing the weight of a door he might be willing to open. She thanked him without being warm about it, because warmth would have felt false, and he would have known it, and she went back through Harlan's Creek to where Elias was waiting with the wagon. He looked at her face when she climbed up. Well, he said. There are 7 families, she said, not just us. 7 loans, same clause, same bank. Elias went very still. 7. He's been building it for years, Clara said. Systematically. Each foreclosure gives him more land, more leverage, more ability to control the valley. She looked out at the main street, at the gold lettering above the bank door catching the winter afternoon light. He's not doing this because he needs the money. He's doing it because he wants the valley. What do we do? Elias said. Not helpless, just asking the way he asked her things now, with a directness that trusted her answer would be worth hearing. We go to the federal marshal's office, she said, and before we do that, we put together everything we have. The original note, the financial analysis, Deacon's account of how the clause was written, and why, and the record of the other 6 families. She looked at him. 7 foreclosures in the same valley using the same fraudulent clause with documentary evidence and a witness who participated in the arrangement. That's not a civil dispute between a lender and a borrower. That's a federal matter. Deacons would have to say that publicly, Elias said. He might, Clara said. I think he's closer to it than he was this morning. Elias was quiet. The horse shifted in its traces, impatient with the cold and the standing still. The other 6 families, he said. Do you know who they are? Not yet, but Deacons does. She looked at him. If they know what's happening, if they understand that they're not alone in this, that there's a pattern and there's evidence and there's someone willing to take it to a federal office, that changes the calculation for all of them. Some of them might not want to get involved, might be too scared of Corwin. Some of them, Clara agreed, but not all 7. You only need enough. Elias picked up the reins. He sat there for a moment, looking down the street at the town he had come into for supplies, and for doctors, and for the occasional reminder that the world still existed beyond the mountain. The town that had watched him bury his wife, that had watched Clara step in front of Harlan the afternoon she arrived, while everyone else found things to look at. You know what's going to happen if we do this and it doesn't work, he said. It wasn't a warning. It was the specific honesty of a man who had learned not to talk himself into optimism he couldn't afford. I know, Claire said. We'd lose the land, lose the cabin, 7 children with nowhere to go. I know. And you still think we should do it? She turned to look at him fully. The winter light was flat and gray and honest, and it showed him as he was, tired, determined, sitting on a wagon seat with his worn gloves and his 3 days' growth of beard and his flat dark eyes that missed very little. Not a romantic figure, not a hero. A man who loved his children and his land and had been failed by a system that was supposed to be impartial and was not. I think doing nothing is also a choice, Clara said. And I think we both already know what that choice leads to. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he clicked to the horse and they moved. The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of work, the kind that doesn't show on your hands or your back, but lives behind your eyes and follows you to sleep. Clara wrote letters. She drafted the financial analysis with the precision her father had taught her, working through the evenings at the kitchen table with the journals open, translating what the promissory note actually said versus what Corwin's bank was claiming it said, building the argument in layered, documented steps the way you build a case that needs to stand under pressure. Thomas found her there one night near midnight, and instead of going back to bed, he sat down across from her and said, "Show me what you're doing." She showed him. He was 16 and he had his father's mind for things that needed to be figured out rather than felt. And he stayed for 2 hours, asking questions that were sometimes basic and sometimes sharp, helping her see where the argument needed to be clearer, where a gap existed that Corwin's lawyers could slip through. When he finally went to bed, he said from the doorway, "You're going to need more than paper." "I know," Clara said. "We're going to need Deacons. Is he going to do it?" She thought about the man at the lunch counter, the weight in his face, the way he had looked when she asked him where the records were kept. "I think so," she said. "I think he's been waiting for someone to ask him the right way." Thomas nodded and disappeared up the stairs, and Clara turned back to her papers, and the fire burned low around her, and somewhere outside the mountain was doing what the mountain always did, which was persist. On a Thursday morning, 18 days after the letter arrived, a rider came up the mountain with a message from Robert Deakins. It was short. It said only, "I'll be at the federal office in Glen Rock on the 14th. Come if you're coming." Elias read it at the breakfast table. He passed it to Clara. She read it and set it down and looked at him across the table with 7 children between them eating their breakfast with the noise and momentum of lives that had no idea what the next week would mean for them. "The 14th, Elias said. 4 days, Clara said. Rachel, who was not as unobservant as people sometimes assumed, looked between them and said nothing. Thomas, who had been there at midnight and knew what the paper said, picked up his coffee and drank it without looking at either of them, which was his way of saying he already knew. Jonah, entirely unaware of any of it, said, "Are there more biscuits?" "Yes," Claire said. She got up and got them. She put the plate down and looked around the table. At all of them, this loud and complicated and imperfect collection of people she had arrived among as a stranger 6 weeks ago. And she felt something that she didn't immediately have words for. Not peace, something more unsteady than peace, more contingent. The feeling of a person who is committed to something they can't take back and is still, in the part of themselves that remained honest, not entirely certain how it ends. But certain enough. That was the thing. Certain enough to go. They left for Glen Rock before dawn on the 14th. Elias had wanted to leave the night before and sleep at the inn at the bottom of the mountain, but the road had iced over in the night and they'd lost 3 hours waiting for the sun to do enough work on the north-facing stretch that the wagon could move without sliding. By the time they reached the valley floor, the morning was already gone and the afternoon was leaning toward cold. Thomas stayed behind with the children. Clara had told him the night before, standing in the kitchen after the others were in bed, and he had listened without interrupting and then said, "Come back with something." Not a question, not quite a command. The statement of a boy who had decided to believe in something and needed it to hold. "We will," Clara said. She didn't say "I promise." She had learned in the weeks since arriving on this mountain that the Walker family had a complicated relationship with promises. They had been made too many times by people who hadn't understood what they were undertaking. She would not add to that count unless she was certain, and she was not yet certain of anything except the work she had done, and the argument she had built, and the man who was either going to be waiting at the federal office in Glen Rock or wasn't. Deakins was there. He was standing outside the federal building when they pulled up. A 2-story stone building on the main street of Glen Rock that looked considerably more substantial than anything in Harlan's Creek, which was either reassuring or intimidating depending on what you needed from it. Deakins had his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who had not slept well and had made his decision anyway, which Clara recognized because she had looked the same way in the mirror that morning. "You came," he said. "So did you," Clara said. He looked at Elias. The two men regarded each other with the particular wariness of people connected by damage. one the cause, at least partially, and one the recipient, and both of them standing in front of a building that was supposed to represent something larger than either of them. "Mr. Walker," Deacon said, "I owe you an explanation." "Later," Elias said. Not harsh, just practical. "Let's do the part that matters first." Federal Marshal Cal Briggs was a man in his mid-50s who had the look of someone who had seen enough in his career to be difficult to surprise, and who took this quality seriously as a professional asset. He had a wide desk, a narrow window, and the expression of a man who had learned that most of the people who came to see him believed their problem was unique when it usually wasn't. Clara laid the documents on his desk in the order she had decided on the night before, working through the logic of it the way her father had taught her to present a medical case, not with emotion first, but with the clearest possible sequence of facts, building from the foundation so that the conclusion arrived as something inevitable rather than argued. The promissory note first. The interest clause, with her analysis written in the margins in her clean, precise hand. The mathematical demonstration of what the clause actually permitted versus what Corwin's bank had applied. Numbers that did not require interpretation, that said what they said regardless of who was reading them. Then the pattern. 6 other loans, same clause, same drafting period, same subsequent transfer to Corwin's bank. She had found 4 of the other families in the 2 weeks of preparation, had written to them, carefully, explaining what she understood and asking what they had experienced. 3 had written back. 3 accounts, all different in their particulars and all identical in their structure, like different verses of the same bad song. Marshal Briggs read without speaking. He read slowly, which she took as a good sign. A man who dismissed things read fast. A man who was building his own understanding read the way Briggs read, which was with pauses and occasional backtracking and the occasional flat look at a specific line. Deacon sat in the chair beside Clara, and when Briggs looked up at him, he told his part of it. He told it without embellishment and without excessive self-exculpation, which Clara had quietly advised him toward the week before when they'd met a second time at the lunch counter. "Don't make yourself the victim of your own story," she'd said. "Just tell what happened. The facts will carry the weight without you helping them." He told it. The clause had been drafted to specification, Corwin's specification, communicated through an intermediary so that nothing was in writing. The loans had been arranged with borrowers who were under financial stress and unlikely to have the resources to challenge the terms later. The transfer to Corwin's bank had happened on a schedule, 18 months, just long enough to create the appearance of a legitimate financial transaction rather than a predatory one. "How many total properties?" Briggs said. 7 that I know of directly," Deacon said. "There may be others through intermediaries I wasn't part of." "And you participated in this arrangement?" "Yes," Deacon said. He didn't look away. "I did." Briggs looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Clara. "You put this together." "My husband provided the original documentation," Clara said. "I provided the analysis." "You have a legal background?" "Medical," she said. "My father managed institutional finances for 30 years. He taught me to read documents." Briggs looked back at the papers on his desk. He was quiet for long enough that the room began to feel like a held breath. "The water supply," Clara said. She reached into her bag and placed the last document on the desk, the one she had saved. 3 weeks ago, our well water made 2 of the children sick. Not severely, but enough. When my husband cleared the upper section of the well casing, he found evidence of deliberate contamination, sulfur compound, not naturally occurring at that concentration. Elias, who had been sitting in the third chair and saying nothing until now, said, "I've got a sample. I brought it down." He reached into his coat and placed a small sealed glass jar on the desk. Briggs looked at the jar. "He was trying to drive you out before the deadline," Briggs said. It wasn't a question anymore. "If we got sick enough, or if the children got sick enough, we might have left voluntarily," Clara said. "Then there's no foreclosure proceeding, no public record, no opportunity for anyone to examine the loan terms." "Cleaner for him," Briggs said. "Yes." Another silence. Briggs put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the spread of papers in front of him. The documents, the analysis, the 3 letters from the other families, Deacon's account, the jar of well water. And Clara watched him taking the full weight of it, Not just the individual pieces, but the accumulated shape of what it meant when you laid it all out together. I'm going to need to keep these, Briggs said. I have copies, Clara said. Of everything. He almost smiled. Almost. Of course you do. Quotes. They did not get an immediate answer. That was the thing that Clara had prepared herself for and had still found difficult to sit inside. The reality that the machinery of consequence, when it finally moved in the right direction, did not move fast. Briggs told them he would need to verify, to contact the other families directly, to examine the records at Corwin's bank under the authority of his office. He told them the deadline on the foreclosure would need to be addressed through an emergency injunction, which he would file that afternoon, which would halt the proceeding while the investigation was active. How long? Elias said. Investigation like this? Weeks. Maybe 2 months. And in the meantime, nobody touches your land. Briggs looked at him steadily. That's what the injunction does. It freezes the situation where it is. They drove back up the mountain in the early dark, the horse's breath making clouds in the cold air, the wagon rattling over frozen ground. Clara sat beside Elias on the bench seat rather than in the wagon bed, which had become her place over the past weeks without either of them making a particular decision about it. He drove, and she sat, and the mountain came up around them, the dark shapes of the trees against the darker sky. 2 months, Elias said, somewhere in the middle of the road. At least, Clara said, and we just wait. We just wait, she said, and we document everything. Anything that happens on or near that property, we write it down with a date and a time, she paused, and we tell the other families what's happening. They deserve to know. He was quiet for a while. The horse knew the road well enough to navigate the upper switchbacks without much guidance, which left Elias with his hands loose on the reins and his thoughts somewhere she couldn't see. You were afraid, he said, in that office. You hid it well, but you were afraid. She looked at him. Yes. So was I, he said, which was, for Elias Walker, a remarkable admission. I know, she said. How'd you know? You held your hat the same way Deacon's held his, she said. When people are frightened and trying not to show it, they do something with their hands. He looked down at his hands on the reins. He said, and nothing else. But there was something in his voice that was almost wry, which was the closest she'd heard him come to humor. They reached the cabin to find Thomas standing on the porch. Not anxiously. He wasn't the anxious kind of standing. He was the deliberate kind, the kind that had decided to wait outside rather than inside because outside meant he'd see them coming. When the wagon came into the yard, he came down the porch steps and looked at his father and then at Clara. Well, he said, the same word he always used when he needed the answer but didn't want to perform the need. Injunction filed, Clara said. The foreclosure is halted. Investigation is open. Something moved across Thomas's face that he contained quickly, but not quite quickly enough. The thing underneath the containment, the thing he kept locked down, had kept locked down for 3 years. The thing that was 17 years old underneath the armor looked, for just a second, like pure relief. Okay, he said. He went back inside. Clara and Elias looked at each other. That's as close to celebrating as he gets, Elias said. I know, Clara said. It's enough. Mama. Silas Corwin was arrested on a Thursday morning in late January, 6 weeks after the meeting in Glen Rock. Marshal Briggs came up the mountain himself to tell them, which Clara thought was either protocol or decency, and she chose to believe it was the latter. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Rachel put in front of him and told them that the examination of Corwin's records had revealed not 7 fraudulent loans, but 11, spread across 2 counties, totaling a combined land value that made what had happened to the Walker property look like a footnote. He told them Deakins had testified fully, that his testimony, combined with the documentary evidence and the water contamination sample, which had confirmed deliberate introduction of the sulfur compound, had been enough for a federal warrant. What happens to Deakins? Clara asked. He cooperated fully, Briggs said. There will be consequences, but the cooperation matters. He won't be practicing in lending again, but he's not looking at prison. He paused. He asked me to tell you something. What? Briggs looked slightly uncomfortable with being a messenger, which she found humanizing. He said you asked him the right questions. He said nobody had ever asked him the right questions before. The marshal picked up his coffee. I don't entirely know what that means, but I passed it along. Clara did know what it meant. It meant that sometimes the difference between a person doing the wrong thing and stopping was simply someone sitting down across from them and treating the situation like a problem that could still be solved rather than a verdict that had already been delivered. Her father had believed that about medicine, and she had come to believe it about most things. The injunction was lifted. The foreclosure proceeding was dissolved. The title to the Walker property, which had been in a state of legal suspension for 2 months, was confirmed and recorded in a way that was considerably harder to challenge than it had been before. 4 of the 11 families whose loans were under investigation received similar resolutions. The others were more complicated. Some had already lost their land, and the process of recovering it was longer and uglier and not guaranteed. Clara wrote 3 letters on behalf of those families, to lawyers in Denver who she had found through Briggs, explaining the situation in the language she had learned to use, precise and documented and without emotional appeal, because emotional appeal in legal matters was ammunition for the other side. She did not know how those cases would resolve. She followed them for months. Spring came to the mountain the way spring came there, reluctantly, in fits, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. A warm week followed by a late snow that undid half of what had softened. And then, finally, something that held. The aspen came out. The mud happened, which was its own ordeal, the yard becoming a problem to be navigated rather than crossed. But on the other side of the mud came the grass, and the smell of things growing, and the return of the particular light that high elevation gets in the late afternoon when the sun is low and the air is clear. Clara opened her medical trunk again, properly this time. Not in an emergency, not under pressure, deliberately, on a Tuesday morning when the house was quiet and she had time to do it right. She went through everything her father had left her, the instruments, the journals, the reference texts with his annotations in the margins in handwriting she could still hear as his voice. She made an inventory. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She organized what had been disrupted the night of Grace's fever into something that could be found when it was needed. The valley needed a doctor. She had understood this since arriving, had seen it in the way people talked about illness, in the distance to the nearest physician, in the fact that Ruth Walker had died of a fever that, in a city with proper medical access, would likely have been treatable. She was not a licensed physician. She had never been one, technically, though her training had exceeded that of half the men who held the license. What she was, practically, was the most medically knowledgeable person within a 3-hour radius, and the valley did not have the luxury of credential requirements. She started with the families she already knew, the Hendersons with the dairy cows, who had a child with a chronic chest problem that had never been properly assessed. The Garrity family, 2 miles east, where the grandmother had been managing a wound on her leg that was beginning to show signs of serious infection. A young woman in Harlan's Creek, who was pregnant with her 3rd child and had lost the 2nd one at birth, and was frightened in the specific way of people who know what can go wrong because they have already watched it go wrong. She went to them one at a time, on the days when Elias could spare the wagon, and on some days when he couldn't, and she rode instead. She did not set up an office. She did not present herself with any particular formality. She came, she assessed, she treated what she could treat, and explained what she couldn't, and she told each person what to watch for and when to send for her. Word travels in small valleys. By May, people were sending for her directly. Elias did not comment on this immediately. He had a tendency to observe things for a while before saying anything about them, which she had come to understand was not indifference but a form of respect. He believed that people were entitled to do what they were doing before they had to explain it to him. But one evening in late April, when she came back from the Henderson place with mud on her coat and a tiredness that lived behind her eyes rather than in her body, he looked at her across the kitchen and said, "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" she said. "The medicine." He said it without judgment, just as an observation. "You're not stopping." "No," she said, "I'm not." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Just Good? What else would I say? He met her eyes with that direct, unhurried gaze. You're the best doctor this valley has ever had, and you've been pretending you aren't for 3 years. It seems like a waste. She was quiet for a moment. You know I'm not licensed. I know you saved Grace, he said. I know you diagnosed the Henderson boy's lung condition in 10 minutes when 3 other people had been calling it a weakness of constitution for 2 years. I know what I've seen. He picked up his coffee. The territory doesn't have enough doctors to be particular about paperwork. The medical board in Denver might disagree. Then we'll deal with that if it comes up, he said. Not dismissive, practical. The way he handled most things, with the steady pragmatism of a man who had learned that problems were better met when they arrived than borrowed in advance. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was warm, the fire going properly, Grace asleep upstairs after a day that had involved a great deal of determined climbing of things that weren't meant to be climbed. Rachel had taken Hannah to visit the Garrity girls for the afternoon. The twins were outside doing something that had been suspiciously quiet for the past hour. Jonah was at the table in the corner working on a knot project that had expanded in ambition over the weeks into something that now involved 3 separate lengths of rope and a level of concentration that precluded conversation. Thomas was outside with his father's horse, which he'd been training with a patience that surprised people who only knew his surface. This was the house. This was what it was now. Not quiet and not simple, and frequently chaotic in the specific way of houses that contain many people who are all in the middle of becoming who they're going to be. But real. Solid. A thing that was, against some odds, continuing. Elias, Clara said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, she said, and I'd like you to just listen until I'm done. He set down his coffee. All right. When I answered your advertisement, she said, I was running away from something. I told you what it was, the story about the hospital, and that was true. But the fuller truth is that I had also stopped believing I deserved anything particular. I thought if I could just be useful somewhere, if I could just find a place where the work was real and the need was real and nobody knew my history, that would be enough. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. I didn't come here expecting to love anyone. I wasn't allowing myself to think in those terms. Elias was very still. I'm telling you this, she said, because I think you deserve to know who you actually married and what she was actually carrying when she got off that stagecoach. She paused. And because it's different now. What I expected and what is actually true are different things. The fire settled. Jonah, who was very focused on his rope, showed no signs of having heard anything, which was either genuine or the very effective selective deafness of a child who understands that some conversations belong to other people. Clara, Elias said. His voice was the same as always, low, unhurried, but there was something in it that was different from the way he had said her name even a month ago. I wrote that advertisement because I needed someone practical, someone who could hold things together. He looked at his hands for a moment, those worn, rough hands. What I got was someone who saved my daughter and exposed a man who was stealing from 7 families and rode out in mud season to see about an old woman's infected leg. He looked up. I don't know what word you use for that. I just know it's not what I advertised for. No, Claire said. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things. I've got better at it, I think, since you came. But I want you to know that I see you, what you are, not what you do, though what you do is considerable. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. I mean, who you are. She looked at him across the table. This man she had not known 4 months ago. This man who had shaken her hand in a street and said she was smaller than he expected and meant it as an observation rather than a diminishment. Who had sat in a chair all night while she worked and had not gotten in her way and had not needed to be thanked. Who had listened to the worst story she knew how to tell and said, I'll get the camphor from the barn. I know you see me, she said quietly. That's what I'm telling you, that it matters. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was not a romantic gesture, not performed, not packaged. Just a hand placed over a hand, the simple physical declaration of a man who showed things through doing rather than saying, and who had just, in his own way, said something. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a while, in the warm kitchen of the rough cabin on the side of the mountain, while Jonah worked on his knots and the fire did its ordinary work, and the evening came down over the valley outside, and it was not perfect. It was not resolved. It was not without the things that would still need to be figured out and worked through and sometimes argued about in the kitchen at 11 at night when they were both tired and had different opinions about what the right thing to do was. But it was real. It was theirs. Months later, nearly a year after Clara had stepped off the stagecoach into a street full of people who had decided not to act, she was coming back from the Henderson place on an October afternoon when she crested the last rise before the cabin and stopped the horse. From up here, she could see the whole clearing. The barn, repaired properly now. The collapsed section rebuilt by Thomas and Elias over 2 weeks in July. The fence that went all the way around and held. The garden Clara had put in May. Modest, practical, but producing. The woodpile stacked in the ordered way she'd insisted on, which took longer to build but was easier to work from in the cold. And the people. Elias at the woodpile, splitting something with the methodical rhythm she knew by sound now. Grace toddling in the yard after the dog, both of them equally determined. Jonah on the porch with his rope. Hannah through the kitchen window, visible from up here as movement and light. Thomas came out of the barn and looked up and saw her on the rise, and he raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement. The gesture of a person who has stopped needing to check whether you're going to leave and has moved on to simply tracking where you are. She raised her hand back. She sat there for a moment longer than she needed to, just looking at it. At this ordinary, difficult, unglamorous life on the side of a Colorado mountain that was nothing like anything she had imagined for herself and everything, it turned out, that she had needed. The world had told Clara Bennett in a number of ways and over a number of years that she was too much or not enough, or the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of place. It had told her this through the hospital board in Philadelphia, and the landlords in Boston, and the crowd in Harlan's Creek who had watched a drunk man threaten a child and found things to look at across the street. It had told her through the years of being precisely right and having no authority for it to matter, and the years after that of not knowing what to do with what she knew. She had spent a long time trying to figure out what was wrong with her. She understood now that the question had been wrong. Not her. The question. There was nothing wrong with her that a place willing to see her clearly couldn't resolve. The mountain didn't care about her credentials or her history or the way people in Philadelphia had talked about her after she left. The children didn't care. Elias, who was not an easy man and would never be an easy man and would still, on bad days, retreat into a silence so complete you couldn't find the edge of it, Elias did not care. What they cared about was what she did and who she was, which turned out to be the same thing because she was someone who did not stop. She put her heels to the horse and rode down into the clearing, and the dog abandoned Grace and came barking toward her with tremendous enthusiasm, and Grace fell down in the mud and sat there looking at the sky with the philosophical acceptance of a 2-year-old who has learned that falling is just part of moving, and Elias looked up from the woodpile and watched her come. She stopped the horse at the fence and got down and went through the gate, and she was home. Not the home she had come from, not the home she had imagined, the home she had built with her own 2 hands out of patience and work, and the decision, made over and over in small moments when it would have been easier not to stay. That was the whole of it. That was enough.